In the apathetic gray of an 1877 afternoon, a boy named Tobias Drexler lay dead, though the stillness of his body was not the strangest part of the story. The paradox that would haunt the town for years to come began not with a scream, but with a sound far quieter, a murmur that should not have been possible. For although the boy's heart was silent and his lungs held no air, his parents, broken by their loss, swore they could hear him whispering from the coffin. This is the account of that impossibility, a chronicle of a whisper that defied the finality of death itself. If the echoes of lost stories compel you, and you have just found your way to this archive, consider subscribing to ensure you do not lose your path back. The Drexler home had surrendered to the quiet tyranny of grief. Heavy damask curtains, once a deep and vibrant burgundy, were drawn tight against the weak autumn light, rendering the parlor a chamber of perpetual twilight. The air itself felt thick, not merely with the dust motes that swam lazily in the few stray beams of light, but weighted with the scent of wilting lilies and the faint, cloying smell of beeswax from the two tall candles that stood vigil at either end of a simple pine box. Within this box, resting on a bed of hastily arranged white satin, lay the body of Tobias Drexler. He was 9 years old. His face, framed by dark, almost black hair that his mother had meticulously combed with trembling hands, was a mask of placid alabaster. The subtle blue tint beneath his fingernails and the waxy translucent pallor of his skin offered irrefutable, silent testimony to the town doctor's pronouncement 3 days prior: a sudden fever, a rapid and inexplicable decline, and a final, breathless silence. His chest, a small, fragile thing beneath a starched white shirt buttoned to the collar, was utterly, unnervingly still. There was no rise, no fall, nothing to suggest the intricate machinery of life was merely paused. It had been dismantled completely, leaving behind only this perfect, chilling effigy of the boy who had once filled the house with the chaotic noise of childhood. His mother, Elara, sat nearest to the coffin, her chair pulled so close that her black dress brushed against the rough-hewn wood. She was a statue carved from sorrow, her hands knotted so tightly in the lap of her dress that her knuckles were as white as her son's face. The garment, a dull, lifeless crepe, seemed to absorb what little light dared to enter the room, making her a figure of pure shadow. Her husband, Alistair, sat in a high-backed armchair across from her, a leather-bound book of accounts resting unread on his knee. Alistair was a man of ledgers and ink, a clerk for the town's most prosperous merchant, and his life was governed by the comforting, predictable logic of numbers and transactions. His hands, usually smudged with the dark, indelible residue of his profession, were now scrubbed raw, as if he could wash away the profound helplessness that had taken root in his soul. It was Alistair's single, humanizing vanity that his ledgers were always perfectly balanced. Before this, he had believed that all of life, even its sorrows, could eventually be reconciled. But the presence of his son's body in their parlor was a debt that could never be paid, an entry that threw the entire ledger of his existence into chaos. The grandfather clock in the hall, a wedding gift from Elara's father, had been stopped at 3:17, the precise moment of Tobias's passing, its sudden silence a far more oppressive presence than its usual. Steady ticking, the mirrors throughout the house were draped in black cloth, an old tradition meant to prevent the soul of the deceased from becoming trapped in the reflection. But in the Drexler home, it felt more as if the house itself were blindfolding itself, unable to bear witness to the horror within its walls. It was Elara who first broke the suffocating silence, though not with a sob or a lamentation. Her movements were unnervingly precise. She leaned forward, her body a thin, sharp line of an instinct that had refused to die with her son, and pressed her ear near the pale, parted lips of the boy. The air was cold around the coffin, a distinct pocket of chill that seemed to emanate from the body itself, a cold that had nothing to do with the autumn day outside. Alistair watched her, his heart a dull, aching weight in his chest. He expected a fresh wave of tears, another tremor of the grief that had shaken the foundations of their lives. Instead, she straightened up slowly, her eyes wide with a look he could not decipher. It was not sorrow, not precisely. It was a flicker of something else, something akin to bewildered, terrified disbelief. She told him, her own voice a dry rustle of sound, to listen. She said the boy was making a sound. Alistair's immediate response was a wave of profound and sorrowful pity, a sudden, sharp fear that the immense strain had finally fractured his wife's mind. He told her gently that grief played tricks on the ear, that the old house was full of sighs and murmurs, that they were only now, in this terrible quiet, able to hear. He spoke of the wind in the chimney and the natural settling of the floorboards. He offered her a dozen rational, comforting explanations, each one a small, desperate plea for sanity to hold its ground in their crumbling world. He insisted, his voice softer than he intended, that what she heard was only the echo of her own breaking heart. But Alara was adamant, her gaze unwavering. She had not imagined it. She described the sound not as a word, and not even as a breath, but as a thread of air, a faint, sibilant whisper that was almost too quiet to be perceived. It was, she insisted with a chilling certainty, the sound of a voice trying to form a word but lacking the breath to give it life. She begged him to come closer, to put his own ear to their son's lips and hear for himself. Torn between the desire to soothe her and the deep, primal dread of indulging what he believed to be a grief-stricken hallucination, Alistair rose from his chair. The floorboards groaned under his weight, the sound unnervingly loud in the cathedral-like stillness. He knelt beside the coffin, the cloying scent of the lilies and the hot, waxy smell of the candles filling his senses. He felt a profound sense of trespass, of violating the solemnity of his son's final, hard-won rest. He lowered his head, his cheek almost brushing the cold, unnaturally smooth skin of Tobias's face. He held his own breath, straining to hear anything beyond the frantic, terrified pounding of blood in his own ears. For a long, agonizing moment, there was nothing. There was only the profound, absolute silence of a body from which all life, all warmth, all possibility had fled. He was about to pull away, to confirm for his wife in the kindest possible terms that it was only their sorrow speaking to them, when he detected it. It was not a sound in the conventional sense, not something that traveled through the air to his eardrum. It was more a vibration, a faint, almost imperceptible disturbance in the air right at the absolute threshold of hearing. It was so quiet that his rational mind immediately began to offer explanations, dismissing it as the rustle of the cheap satin lining or the microscopic movement of his own clothing. Yet, it had a quality, a texture, that was difficult to dismiss. It felt intentional. He did not tell Alara what he had almost heard. He could not. To give voice to it would be to give it reality, to invite a madness into the room that he was not prepared to face. He rose to his feet, his face a carefully constructed mask of paternal authority, and repeated his earlier assertions that it was nothing, simply the wind playing tricks. He could not bring himself to validate her delusion, yet a cold seed of profound, terrible unease had been planted within him. He returned to his chair and picked up his book, staring at the columns of numbers without comprehending a single digit. His mind was no longer on the text, but on the chilling stillness of the boy in the box, a stillness that was now, somehow, questionable. Alara did not press him further. She simply resumed her vigil, her gaze fixed on her son's face, her posture that of someone listening intently for a secret only she was meant to hear. The two of them sat in that darkened room, separated by a chasm of unspoken fear, the silence between them now filled with a terrible, unasked question. Later that afternoon, as the gray light outside began to fail, the neighbors began to arrive. This was the custom, a solemn parade of condolence and quiet support, a ritual as old as the town itself. They came in small, somber groups, their faces etched with practiced sympathy, their hands carrying foil-wrapped dishes of food that would go uneaten. Phineas, the blacksmith, a large and powerfully built man whose life was a symphony of hammer and fire, seemed awkward and small by the confines of the grieving house. He removed his woolen cap, his big hands fumbling with the brim as he mumbled a few inadequate words to Alistair. His wife, Temperance, a woman known throughout the town for her sharp opinions and endless, energetic chatter, was uncharacteristically silent, her hand clutching a small, leather-bound Bible, as if it were a talisman against some unseen malevolence. They approached the coffin, as was expected, to pay their final respects to the boy they had all seen playing with a hoop and stick in the dusty street only a week before. And it was here, in the immediate vicinity of the pine box, that the unspoken wrongness of the room became most acute. It was a physical sensation, a palpable change in the atmosphere that defied easy description. Several of the visitors would later, in the hushed privacy of their own homes, confide in their spouses that the air around the coffin felt unnaturally cold and heavy, as though it were being pressed down by an invisible weight. One woman, a distant cousin named Verity, who had a reputation for being overly sensitive, felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to look over her shoulder, a prickling sensation on the back of her neck that suggested she was being watched from within the room. She saw nothing but the sorrowful faces of the other mourners, yet the feeling lingered, a cold, creeping dread that had nothing at all to do with the simple sadness of the occasion. No one spoke of it. Not there, not in that house. They would stand for a moment, their heads bowed, their eyes fixed on the pale, serene face of the boy, and then they would retreat, their movements subtly quicker, more furtive, than when they had approached. Their words of comfort to Alistair and Alara seemed rushed, their desire to leave the oppressive atmosphere of the house a palpable, urgent thing they tried to hide behind sympathetic smiles. They offered to bring food, to run errands, to provide any assistance the family might need, their generosity a thin veil for their deep-seated, instinctual discomfort. They were good people, friends and neighbors who had shared in the Drexlers' modest joys and now sought to share in their sorrow, but something in that parlor repelled them on a primal level. It was more than the mere presence of death. Death, in 1877, was a frequent and familiar visitor in every household. This was something else entirely, an aberration that the well-worn rituals of mourning were not equipped to handle. The silence in the room felt different from the respectful quiet of a wake. It felt like a held breath, a tense, expectant hush that seemed to vibrate with an unspoken and unnerving energy. They fled the house not with a sense of sorrowful duty fulfilled, but with the quiet, shaken relief of a narrow escape. As dusk began to bleed through the edges of the drawn curtains, casting the room in shades of deep purple and black, the last of the neighbors departed, leaving the Drexlers once again to their solitary vigil. The house settled back into its profound quiet, but the atmosphere had been irrevocably changed. The unspoken unease of the visitors had remained behind, a residue of fear that now mingled with the parents' own burgeoning dread. Alistair found he could no longer sit still. He began to pace the small room, his footsteps a frantic, rhythmic counterpoint to the dead silence of the clock in the hall. He kept glancing at the coffin, then at his wife, who had not moved from her chair in hours. Her focus remained entirely on Tobias, her head tilted slightly as if she were still listening, still waiting. Finally, Alistair could bear it no longer. The whispers his wife claimed to hear, the neighbor's palpable fear, the unnerving sensation he himself had experienced, it was all coalescing into a single, monstrous thought that threatened to shatter his rational mind. With a sudden, jarring finality, he announced that he was going to fetch the doctor. He told Alara that a formal examination was required before the burial, a finality that would be documented and filed away, a last word from the world of science and reason. But his true motive was far more desperate. He needed another person of authority, a man of medicine, to stand in that room and declare, with unwavering certainty, that their son was dead. He needed to hear it again, to have the impossible whispers and the chilling atmosphere exorcised by a voice of cold, clinical fact. He needed science to silence the doubt that was beginning to scream in his own mind. For as he looked at the small, still form of his son, a terrifying question echoed in the depths of his soul. If Tobias was truly and completely gone, why did it feel so much like he was still in the room with them? The decision was made. The boy's body would be taken from the house, removed from the suffocating intimacy of their grief, and delivered into the cold, impartial halls of the town morgue. It was a desperate attempt to impose order on a world that was rapidly descending into madness, a flight from a terror that had taken root within their own home. The journey from the Drexler home to the town morgue was a passage from one form of silence to another. The first was the silence of a home hollowed out by loss, a quiet filled with the ghosts of memory and the weight of unshed tears. The second was the silence of institutional finality, a cold, sterile quiet that smelled of carbolic acid and damp stone. The pine coffin, carried by two grim-faced men from the undertaker's office, was loaded onto a simple horse-drawn cart. Alistair Drexler followed on foot, his wife having remained within the darkened house, a prisoner of her own vigil. The cart's iron-rimmed wheels scraped and echoed on the cobblestones, each sound a percussive, lonely reminder of the grim procession. The townspeople who witnessed its slow progress averted their gazes, their faces disappearing behind lace curtains or into the shadowed doorways of their shops. They offered the illusion of privacy, but their collective silence was a form of witness, their averted eyes a testament to the quiet dread that had already begun to seep into the community's foundations like a slow, cold rain. The air had grown colder since the morning, a damp chill that promised an early and unforgiving winter, and the sky overhead was a uniform sheet of slate gray, offering neither comfort nor light. The morgue stood at the edge of town, adjacent to the cemetery, a squat, windowless building of rough-hewn granite that seemed to have been built to withstand a siege rather than to shelter the dead. It was a place of stark utility, devoid of any architectural grace, its purpose stated plainly by its very form. This was a house for the dead, a final, temporary repository before the earth claimed its own. Its single, heavy oak door was bound with thick bands of black iron, and as it swung open on protesting hinges, it released a gust of air that was noticeably colder than the autumn street, carrying with it the faint, metallic scent of old blood and the sharper, cleaner smell of chemical disinfectant. Inside, the world was one of stone and flickering gaslight. The main chamber was cavernous, the high, vaulted ceiling lost in a web of deep shadows. 3 long stone slabs, each equipped with a shallow drainage channel carved into its perimeter, stood in the center of the room, stark and unyielding. The gas lamps mounted on the walls hissed softly, a constant, sibilant sound, their weak, yellow flames casting long, dancing shadows that made the empty corners of the room seem to writhe with a life of their own. The air was heavy, still, and profoundly cold. A deep, penetrating cold that seeped through the soles of Alistair's boots and seemed to settle deep within his bones. It was a place where grief was not welcome. It was a laboratory where death was cataloged and processed, stripped of its emotional weight and reduced to a series of stark, physical facts. Two attendants, a gaunt, older man named Silas and a younger, more nervous apprentice called Ephraim, took charge of the coffin. They moved with a practiced, almost indifferent efficiency, their movements economical and precise, honed by endless repetition. They lifted the small body from its satin bed and placed it upon the central stone slab. The sound of Tobias's slight form making contact with the cold stone was a soft, dull thud that seemed to reverberate through Alistair's entire body, a sound of absolute finality. The boy looked even smaller now, more fragile, a pale, lost thing in the vast, echoing chamber, dwarfed by the sheer scale of the stone and shadow around him. The attendants worked in near silence, their communication reduced to a series of curt nods and subtle gestures, a silent language developed over years of performing the same grim task. Yet, as they went about their work, a subtle tension began to permeate their well-oiled efficiency. Silas, whose gnarled and steady hands were a testament to decades of this work, found himself fumbling with the small pearl buttons of the boy's shirt. Ephraim, while wiping down a nearby instrument table with a carbolic-soaked rag, let a pair of steel forceps slip from his grasp. The tool clattered onto the stone floor with a sound that was shockingly loud, a sharp, metallic shriek in the oppressive quiet. The younger man flinched violently, his eyes darting towards the body on the slab, then quickly away, as if he expected to see it react to the noise. Silas shot him a sharp, warning glance, a silent command to maintain his composure, but Alistair noticed that the older man's own gaze refused to linger for more than a moment on the boy's placid face. They both felt it, the same unnatural heaviness the neighbors had sensed in the Drexler parlor, a palpable pressure in the air that made the simple, unconscious act of breathing feel like a conscious and difficult effort. Dr. Theron arrived shortly thereafter, his presence filling the room with an aura of unshakable certainty. He was a man in his late 50s, with a neatly trimmed gray beard and gold-rimmed spectacles that sat perched on the bridge of his nose, giving him an owlish, academic air. He radiated an aura of unassailable confidence, a man who believed the universe was a grand, intricate clockwork mechanism, and that with the right tools and sufficient knowledge, every one of its secrets could be laid bare and explained. He greeted Alistair with a curt, professional nod, his expression one of detached sympathy. For him, this was not a human tragedy. It was a clinical procedure, a problem to be solved and filed away. He approached the body with a black leather bag from which he produced his instruments, laying them out on a clean white cloth with the meticulous precision of a watchmaker. He began his examination, his movements methodical, deliberate, and unhurried. He was a creature of empirical evidence, of observable and quantifiable phenomena. He checked for rigor mortis, the stiffening of the limbs, and found it present, as expected in a body of this age. He noted the presence of livor mortis, the purplish, bruise-like discoloration of the skin on the boy's back and legs where the blood had settled due to gravity, another textbook sign of death's irreversible dominion. He pressed a small, polished silver mirror to the boy's lips, holding it there for a full minute, and then held it up for Alistair to see. He pointed to the unblemished, clear surface, a definitive, visual testament to the absence of breath. He listened with his stethoscope, the earpieces firmly in place, moving the cold metal bell across the boy's narrow chest, knowing he would hear nothing but the profound, unbroken silence of a stopped and lifeless heart. When he was finished, he straightened up and turned to Alistair, his voice calm and eminently reasonable. He spoke of the profound trauma of losing a child, explaining that the human mind, under such immense and unbearable distress, was a fragile and often unreliable narrator of its own experience. He used carefully chosen, academic phrases like grief-induced auditory hallucinations and the psyche's powerful tendency to manifest profound desire as sensory illusion. He explained, with a tone that was meant to be comforting but felt dismissive, that what Alistair and his wife had experienced was not a supernatural event, but a deeply and tragically human one. The desire for their son to still be with them, to still be breathing, to still have a voice, was so powerful, he said, that their minds had simply created a phantom sound, a whisper woven from the very fabric of their own sorrow. He told Alistair that he had seen it before in other grieving families, that it was a recognized, if unfortunate, byproduct of severe bereavement. He assured him, his words slow and deliberate, that the boy was unequivocally, biologically, and irreversibly deceased. There was no life, no breath, and certainly, he said with a final paternalistic pat on Alistair's shoulder, no voice. His every word was a brick in a wall of scientific certainty, a fortress designed to keep the chaos of the unknown at bay. Alistair listened, nodding, wanting desperately to believe him. He wanted to accept this rational, clean explanation. He wanted to believe that the whisper was a product of his wife's broken heart and his own exhausted mind, not a phenomenon that defied the fundamental laws of nature. And yet, as the doctor spoke, Alistair could not shake the memory of that faint, vibratory sensation he had felt near his son's lips. Nor could he ignore the palpable sense of dread that still hung in the air of the morgue, a feeling that the doctor, in his fortress of logic, seemed either unable or unwilling to perceive. Dr. Theron, satisfied that he had restored a measure of reason to the situation, packed his instruments away. He gave Silas a few brief, clinical instructions regarding the preparation of the body for burial, and then departed, his confident, brisk footsteps echoing down the long stone corridor until they faded into complete silence. Alistair remained for a moment longer, looking at the small, still form of his son, now officially and scientifically declared dead. The doctor's pronouncement should have brought closure, a final, sad punctuation mark at the end of a short life. Instead, it felt hollow, insufficient. He thanked the attendants in a low voice, and then he too left, stepping back out into the cold, gray afternoon, leaving his son behind in the house of stone. The heavy oak door boomed shut behind him. Inside, the departure of the doctor and the father seemed to change the very quality of the silence. The clinical atmosphere that Dr. Theron had imposed on the room evaporated, replaced by something older and far more unsettling. Silas and Ephraim were alone with the body. They resumed their work, but their movements were now marked by a distinct and shared reluctance. They seemed to move around the slab at a greater distance than was necessary, their bodies unconsciously shying away from the small, still form at the room's center. They communicated in hushed tones, their voices barely audible above the constant hiss of the gas lamps. Alistair saw Ephraim glance over his shoulder more than once, his eyes drawn to the deep, impenetrable shadows that clung to the corners of the ceiling. Silas, while preparing a basin of water and soap, worked with his back to the body, a deliberate posture that seemed both unnatural and deeply telling for a man of his profession. The room was no longer just a laboratory for the dead, it was a chamber holding a terrible secret, and the two men tasked with tending to the body were becoming acutely, terrifyingly aware that they were not alone with it. The cracks in the veneer of reason were beginning to show, and through them, a profound and ancient horror was beginning to seep, cold and silent, into the very stones of the building. The work continued into the late evening, a slow and somber task performed under the flickering, uncertain light. Finally, it was done. Silas, wiping his hands on a damp cloth, told Ephraim that he was leaving for the night. He instructed the younger man to finish the final cleaning of the tools and to ensure the main door was securely bolted from the inside. He would be the last one to leave. The last one left alone with the body of Tobias Drexler. The heavy oak door closed behind Silas with a deep, resonating boom that seemed to be swallowed by the stone walls, leaving his apprentice, Ephraim, in a silence that was suddenly profound and absolute. For a long moment, the young man did not move, listening to the sound of the older attendant's footsteps crunching on the gravel path outside, growing fainter and fainter until they were entirely consumed by the encroaching night. Then, there was nothing. Nothing but the ceaseless, gentle hiss of the gas lamps that lined the walls. It was a sound he had never truly noticed before, but in the absence of all other noise, it seemed to grow in volume, a serpentine whisper that filled the vast cold space. Ephraim was alone. Alone with the dead. This was not a new experience. It was a regular part of his duties, the final locking up, the last tidying of the tools of the trade. But tonight, the familiar routine felt alien, charged with a malevolent energy he could not name. His first act was always the same, to secure the door. He walked across the cold stone floor, his own footsteps echoing with unnerving clarity, and slid the heavy iron bolt into its housing. The sound of the metal grinding into place was a sharp, definitive clang, a sound of imprisonment. It was meant to keep intruders out, but tonight, it felt as if it were sealing him in. He turned back to face the main chamber, and his eyes were immediately, unwillingly drawn to the central slab. The body of Tobias Drexler lay under a thin white sheet that Silas had draped over it before leaving. The sheet did little to conceal the form beneath. It merely softened the edges, turning the small, still body into a gentle, white mound in the center of the vast, shadowy room. Ephraim had been an apprentice for nearly a year. He had taken the job out of a grim necessity, the pay being slightly better than what he could earn at the tannery, and the work, though morbid, was at least quiet. He had learned to cultivate a professional detachment, to see the bodies that passed through this place not as the remnants of people, but as objects, as tasks to be completed. He had become accustomed to the cold, the smells, the unyielding stillness of the dead. But the Drexler boy was different. The unease had been palpable all afternoon, a shared, unspoken current running between him and Silas, a feeling that had only intensified after the doctor, with all his confident pronouncements, had departed. Now, in the solitude of the night, that unease was beginning to curdle into something much closer to fear. He tried to focus on his tasks, on the familiar rhythm of his work. He gathered the instruments that Dr. Theron had used, wiping each one with a cloth soaked in carbolic acid and placing it back into its designated slot in a wooden case. The cold steel felt slick and alien in his hands. As he worked, he found his own breathing had become shallow, his senses heightened to an almost painful degree. Every tiny sound was magnified. The drip of water from a leaky pipe in the adjoining washroom became a slow, deliberate tapping. The hiss of the lamps sounded like a gathering of voices, just at the edge of hearing. The shadows cast by the flickering flames seemed to dance with a new and sinister energy, stretching and contorting in the periphery of his vision. He tried to rationalize his growing paranoia, recalling the doctor's words about grief and hallucination. Perhaps it was suggestion, he told himself. The parents' strange insistence, the oppressive atmosphere of the day, it was only natural that it would infect his own mind, especially here, in this place, at this hour. He was simply tired, his imagination running away from him. He resolved to finish his work quickly and retreat to the warmth and life of his own small rented room above the bakery. His next task was to mop the floor around the central slab where some water had been spilled. He filled a heavy wooden bucket, the sloshing of the water loud in the stillness, and began to work. The rhythmic scrape of the mop on the stone, a comforting, mundane sound. He kept his back to the body, focusing on the patch of floor illuminated by the nearest gas lamp. The circle of light felt like a small island of safety in an ocean of darkness. He worked his way methodically across the floor, his mind a whirlwind of competing thoughts. He tried to think of ordinary things, the taste of the stew his landlady had left for him, the worn cover of the novel on his nightstand, the face of a girl he had spoken to at the market. But the presence behind him was too powerful, a silent, gravitational pull on his attention. He could feel it there, the small, still form on the stone, and the more he tried to ignore it, the more dominant it became in his mind. The air in the room seemed to be growing colder, the damp chill seeping through his thin shirt, raising goosebumps on his arms. He was halfway through his mopping when he heard it for the first time. It was so faint, he almost missed it, a sound so subtle it might have been an illusion, a trick of the ear. It was a soft, dry rustle, like a single dead leaf skittering across a stone path. He froze, the mop handle clutched tightly in his hands. He stood perfectly still, straining to hear, holding his own breath so that not even the sound of his own life would interfere. He listened. The gas lamps hissed. The pipe dripped its slow, steady rhythm, nothing else. He let out his breath in a long, shaky sigh. It was nothing. It was a mouse in the walls, or the wind pressing against the heavy oak door. It had to be. He forced himself to resume his work, but his movements were now jerky and uncertain. The comforting rhythm was gone, replaced by a tense, nervous energy. He found himself glancing over his shoulder every few seconds, his eyes darting towards the white-shrouded form on the slab. It remained perfectly still. Of course it did. The boy was dead. The doctor had proven it. He had nearly finished the floor when the sound came again. This time, it was different. It was not a rustle. It was a whisper. It was faint, impossibly faint, a mere thread of sound, but it was undeniably articulate. It was not a word he could understand, but it had the cadence of a voice, a sibilant, drawn-out exhalation of air. And it was close, terrifyingly close. Ephraim's blood went cold. He dropped the mop. It clattered to the floor, the sound a deafening explosion in the supercharged silence. He stood paralyzed, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. His mind raced, desperately searching for a rational source for the sound. It was the gas lamp. It had to be the gas lamp, a strange fluctuation in the pressure, a trick of the acoustics in the high-ceilinged room. He turned his head slowly, deliberately, towards the lamp on the wall nearest him. He stared at the flame, watching it flicker and dance behind its glass shield. It hissed, as always, but it did not make the sound he had just heard. Then came the third sound, and with it, the final, complete annihilation of his rational mind. The whisper came again, as faint as before, but this time, there was no mistaking its location. It had not come from the stone slab where the body of Tobias Drexler lay. It had not come from any corner of the room, or from the hissing lamps, or from the world outside the thick stone walls. It had come from the empty air directly behind his left shoulder. It was a sound without a source, a voice without a mouth, a breath without lungs. It was an impossibility that was nonetheless happening. In that moment, the carefully constructed walls of Ephraim's composure did not just crack, they disintegrated into dust. A primal, unthinking terror, the likes of which he had never known, seized him completely. It was a fear so pure and so powerful that it bypassed thought entirely. He did not scream. The sound was trapped in his throat, choked off by the violent constriction of his own muscles. He did not turn around. The thought of what he might see in the empty space from which the whisper had come was a horror his mind refused to contemplate. His body acted on its own. He fled. He scrambled away from the center of the room, his boots slipping on the wet floor. He stumbled, catching himself against one of the empty stone slabs. The shock of the cold, hard surface, a distant, unimportant sensation. His only goal was the door. The heavy, bolted, iron-bound door. He reached it, his hands trembling so violently he could barely grasp the cold metal of the bolt. He fumbled with the latch, his fingers numb and useless. For a terrifying second, he thought it was stuck, that he was trapped, and a wave of pure black panic washed over him. He pulled again, with all his strength, a sob of desperation escaping his lips. The bolt screeched as it slid back, the sound a hymn of liberation. He threw his shoulder against the heavy oak, and the door swung inward. A blast of cold, damp night air hit his face, and it was the sweetest, most wonderful sensation he had ever felt. He did not pause. He did not look back. He burst out of the morgue and into the darkness of the cemetery grounds, running, his lungs burning, his mind a perfect, howling void. He ran without direction, driven only by the instinct to put as much distance as possible between himself and the whispering room. And as he ran, his terror-stricken mind latched onto the only symbol of safety and sanctuary it could conjure, the tall, dark steeple of the town church, silhouetted against the starless, unforgiving sky. Ephraim ran. He ran with the desperate, ragged-edged terror of an animal fleeing a predator it cannot see. The damp night air burned in his lungs, each gasping breath a painful reminder of the breathless whisper that pursued him. The cemetery grounds were a treacherous landscape of shifting shadows and unseen obstacles. He stumbled over the low iron fencing of a family plot, his shin cracking against the cold metal. But the flash of pain was a distant, insignificant thing. He scrambled to his feet and kept running, his boots sinking into the soft, rain-soaked earth, the gravestones rising up around him like a forest of pale, silent sentinels. The town was dark, its windows shuttered and lifeless, its streets empty. It was as if the entire world were holding its breath, leaving him utterly alone with his horror. His only beacon was the church steeple, a black spear aimed at a sky devoid of stars. It was the tallest structure in the town, a symbol of order, of sanctuary, of divine protection, and every fiber of his being screamed for him to reach it. He did not think of what he would do when he got there, or what he would say. He was not thinking at all. He was pure, unadulterated flight, a body propelled by a mind that had witnessed an impossibility. He burst from the cemetery gate onto the main street, his footsteps echoing wildly in the unnatural quiet. The church stood at the far end of the town square, its great wooden doors a promise of refuge. He crossed the square, his legs pumping, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He half expected to feel a cold hand fall upon his shoulder, to hear the whisper again, this time at his ear, but nothing came. The only sound was his own labored breathing and the slap of his boots on the cobblestones. He reached the church and threw himself against the massive iron-studded doors. They were, of course, locked for the night. A fresh wave of panic, cold and sharp, pierced through his terror. He beat his fists against the unyielding wood, a series of frantic, desperate blows that were swallowed by the sheer mass of the oak. He rattled the heavy iron latch, the sound a pathetic metallic clatter against the profound silence of the building. He was about to turn, to flee again into the unlit streets, when he found the small, unassuming side door used by the sexton. It was rarely locked with the same diligence as the main entrance. He threw his weight against it, and with a groan of protesting wood, It swung inward, opening into the absolute, ink-black darkness of the narthex. Ephraim stumbled inside, pulling the door shut behind him, plunging himself into a darkness that was somehow deeper and more complete than the night outside. The air within was cool and still, thick with the ancient, holy smells of old wood, melting wax, and the faint, sweet scent of incense that clung to the very stones of the building. For a moment, this sensory familiarity offered a sliver of comfort. This was a house of God, a place of peace and eternal rest. The unnatural horrors of the morgue had no place here. They could not cross this sacred threshold. He leaned against the closed door, his body trembling, trying to catch his breath, his eyes slowly, painfully adjusting to the oppressive gloom. He could just make out the faint outlines of the pews, stretching away into the darkness like rows of silent, praying supplicants. High above, a single sliver of moonlight from a break in the clouds found its way through a high window, illuminating a tiny patch of the far stone wall, a small, ghostly island of light in an ocean of black. He took a hesitant step forward, then another, his hands outstretched, feeling his way towards the main aisle. He intended to make his way to the altar, to fall to his knees, to find some solace in the heart of the sanctuary. He never made it. As he took his third step into the nave, a sound from high above shattered the sacred silence. It was the sound of a single, massive bell, tolling with a deafening, discordant clang. Bong. The sound was not the measured, melodic peal that called the faithful to prayer. It was a violent, jarring crash of bronze on bronze, a sound of alarm, of warning. Ephraim froze, his head snapping upwards towards the bell tower, lost in the darkness far above him. The sexton, old Mr. Abernathy, lived on the other side of town. He was a man of strict routine, and it was not yet 5 a.m. No one should be in the bell tower. Bong. The second toll was even louder than the first, a wave of sound so powerful that he felt it vibrate through the stone floor and up into the bones of his feet. It was a physical assault, a sonic blow that hammered at the very air in the church. He clamped his hands over his ears, a useless gesture against the overwhelming force of the sound. He knew, with a certainty that transcended logic, that no human hand was pulling the rope. This was not the work of the sexton. This was a wild, untamed ringing, a frantic, chaotic clamor that spoke not of order, but of desecration. Bong, bong, bong. The bells began to toll without pause, one crash of sound piling on top of another, creating a relentless, overwhelming torrent of noise that filled the cavernous space of the church. The air itself seemed to shudder with the vibrations, and as the bells tolled, another, more subtle change began to occur. The few candles that had been left burning in their red glass holders on a side altar began to flicker violently, their small flames dancing and sputtering as if caught in a powerful, unfelt wind. One by one, their lights seemed to dim, to shrink, to be consumed not by a lack of wax or air, but by the encroaching, hungry darkness. The shadows in the church, which had been deep but static, now seemed to come alive. They stretched and writhed, flowing like black water across the pews and up the stone columns. The single sliver of moonlight that had offered a point of reference was suddenly extinguished, as if a hand had passed over the window high above. The church was plunged into a darkness that was now almost absolute, a living, breathing entity that seemed to press in on him from all sides. The only illumination came from the dying, guttering flames of the last few candles, their feeble light casting the vast sanctuary in a terrifying, shifting chiaroscuro of black and blood red. Ephraim was no longer thinking of sanctuary. The church was not a refuge, it was a trap. The holy ground offered no protection. The entity from the morgue, the whispering thing that was not Tobias Drexler, had followed him here, Or perhaps it had been here all along, waiting. The thought was a fresh spike of ice in his heart. The bells continued their frantic, insane tolling overhead, the sound a roaring in his ears, a frantic, screaming voice that drowned out all thought. He felt a profound sense of violation, of a sacred space being defiled by a power that was utterly antithetical to it. The very foundations of his world were crumbling. The morgue was a place of death, and what he had experienced there was a horror born of that place. But the church was a place of life, of faith, of salvation. For the horror to follow him here, to not only enter, but to take command of the very bells, to extinguish the holy lights, was a blasphemy so profound it bordered on the apocalyptic. It was a declaration that there was no safe harbor, no place to hide, no power that could stand against it. He was a small, terrified man, caught in a war between forces he could not comprehend, and the side of light and order was losing. His legs, which had carried him in a desperate flight for safety, were now frozen, rooted to the spot by a terror that had evolved into a kind of awe-stricken paralysis. He could not run. He could only stand there, in the dying, flickering light, amidst the stretching, unnatural shadows, and listen to the demonic, unholy ringing of the bells, and wait for what would happen next. The cacophony of the bells reached a feverish, impossible crescendo, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was a physical thing, a crushing weight that was in many ways more terrifying than the noise it replaced. In the abrupt absence of the tolling, Ephraim could hear the frantic, panicked beat of his own heart, a frantic, fleshy drum in the vast, dead quiet of the church. The candles on the side altar, which had been flickering wildly, now burned with a strange and preternatural stillness, their flames as motionless as if they were painted on glass. The shadows they cast froze in place, creating a grotesque tableau of a sanctuary held in a moment of suspended animation. Ephraim stood in the center of the main aisle, a lone, trembling figure in a world that had ceased to move. He was afraid to breathe, afraid to make a sound, convinced that the slightest disturbance would bring about the final, unthinkable culmination of his terror. His eyes, now painfully accustomed to the deep gloom, darted around the cavernous space, searching the impenetrable darkness for any sign of movement, for the source of the malevolent presence that he could feel pressing in on him like a physical weight. It was then that he lifted his eyes. His gaze traveled upward, past the rows of dark, empty pews, past the ornate, unlit pulpit, up the towering stone columns that soared into the unseen heights of the vaulted ceiling. He was not consciously directing his gaze. It was as if some external force were guiding his attention, pulling his focus towards a specific point in the sacred architecture. His eyes came to rest on the great stained glass window that dominated the eastern wall of the transept. It was the church's most prized possession, a masterpiece of colored glass and lead brought over from the old country generations ago. By day, it was a riot of vibrant, jewel-toned color, depicting a host of saints and martyrs in scenes of stoic piety and glorious suffering. Saint Michael, sword aloft, trampled a ruby-red dragon underfoot. Saint Lawrence, serene and accepting, lay upon a gridiron of sapphire flames. Saint Catherine, her face a mask of beatific calm, stood beside a wheel of jagged emerald-green shards. By night, the window was usually just a dark, leaden grid, its colors asleep, waiting for the dawn to bring them back to life. But tonight, it was not dark. A faint, sickly, opalescent light was beginning to emanate from within the glass itself. A cold, sourceless luminescence that was not a reflection of any external light, but a glow that seemed to be born from the very substance of the window. Ephraim watched, mesmerized, as the light grew in intensity, not with the warm, golden radiance of the sun, but with a pale, phosphorescent sheen, the color of moonlight on bone. The familiar figures of the saints, which he had known since childhood, began to waver and distort, their serene, holy faces seeming to melt and run together like heated wax. The vibrant reds, blues, and greens of their robes bled into one another, swirling into a murky, indistinct palette of bruised purples and sickly, jaundiced yellows. The leaden lines that held the composition together, that gave form and meaning to the sacred images, seemed to stretch and bend, the entire window becoming a fluid, unstable canvas of shifting light and color. It was as if the ancient glass were alive, its solid, crystalline structure dissolving into a dreamlike, liquid state. He felt a profound sense of vertigo, as if the very laws of physics were unraveling before his eyes. This was not merely a desecration, it was a perversion of reality itself, a holy object being forcibly remade into an icon of the profane. And then, from within that swirling, chaotic vortex of light and color, a new image began to resolve itself. It was a face. It was not the face of a saint or a martyr. It was a small, pale, achingly familiar face, framed by dark hair. It was the face of Tobias Drexler. It coalesced slowly, the features sharpening out of the luminous mist, the eyes dark and empty, the skin imbued with the same waxy, unnatural pallor it had possessed on the stone slab in the morgue. But this was not a static image. It was alive. The eyes, though devoid of any light or warmth, seemed to see him, to fix upon him with a gaze of ancient, sorrowful knowledge. The expression on the face was one of profound and unnerving placidity, the same serene, untroubled mask he had worn in death. But to see it here, glowing in this impossible living glass, was an obscenity. The image was gigantic, the boy's face filling the entire expanse of the massive window, looking down upon him like a terrible, silent god. Ephraim wanted to look away, to break the gaze of the spectral face, but he was held fast, pinned in place by a force that was equal parts terror and a morbid, irresistible fascination. He could feel a low, humming vibration emanating from the window, a subsonic thrum that he felt in his teeth and in the hollow of his chest. It was the visual equivalent of the whisper he had heard in the morgue, a silent scream that tore at the fabric of the world. He stood there, a tiny, insignificant creature in the shadow of this monstrous, miraculous apparition, his mind struggling to process the impossible sight. The body in the morgue was just a body, a shell, an empty vessel. The doctor had said so, but this was the boy's essence, his spirit, his something. And it was here, in this holy place, manifesting itself not as a ghostly, transparent shade, but as a solid, undeniable presence that had bent the very substance of the church to its will. Then came the final, soul-shattering horror. The face in the glass moved. The pale, bloodless lips, which had been set in that calm, straight line, began to part. The movement was slow, deliberate, and utterly unnatural. Glass should not move. The leaden lines that formed the mouth should not stretch and bend, but they did. The lips drew back from unseen teeth, forming a small, dark O. And from that impossible mouth, fashioned from glowing glass and solidified light, came the whisper. He could not hear it with his ears. The church was still tomb silent, but he heard it in his mind. It was not a single word, but a torrent of them, a flood of sibilant, overlapping sounds that poured into his consciousness, a language of madness and despair. He could not understand the individual words, but he understood the meaning. It was a story of coldness, of darkness, of being alone. It was a lament of a consciousness trapped in a place where it did not belong, a voice calling out from a prison of dead flesh. It was a plea, an accusation, and a threat, all woven together into a single, unending stream of silent sound that promised to tear his sanity to shreds. That was the moment that Ephraim's paralysis finally broke. The sight of the face was a horror, but the silent, mental whisper was an agony he could not endure. It was an invasion of his very soul, a violation far more intimate and terrifying than any physical threat. A raw, guttural scream, the sound he had been unable to produce in the morgue, finally tore its way out of his throat. It was a sound of pure, animal terror, a ragged, hopeless cry that echoed once in the vast, silent church, and then was extinguished. He turned, his limbs clumsy and uncoordinated, and ran. He did not care where he was going, only that it was away from the glowing, whispering window, away from the terrible, sad face of the boy who wasn't breathing. He ran blindly, his arms flailing in the darkness, crashing into pews, stumbling down the aisle, his only thought to escape the church, to get back out into the night, a night that he had just fled, but which now seemed a far safer place than this desecrated, haunted sanctuary. He ran from the face in the glass, a face that would be burned into his memory, a glowing, whispering icon of a horror that had no name and no end. Ephraim did not simply exit the church, he was violently expelled by it, a man ejected from a nightmare only to find that the waking world was now an extension of that same horror. He burst through the sexton's side door and into the raw, damp cold of the night, stumbling down the stone steps and sprawling onto the muddy ground of the churchyard. The impact was a jarring shock to his system, the wet earth soaking through the knee of his trousers, the smell of rot and decay filling his nostrils. For a single, lucid second, the physical sensations were a grounding force, a reminder of a world that was solid and real, but it was a fleeting comfort. He scrambled to his feet, casting a single, terrified glance back at the house of God he had just fled. The great stained glass window was dark once more, a leaden, lifeless grid against the stone. The sickly, internal light was gone. The face was gone. It was as if it had never been there, a private vision granted only to him, a secret blasphemy that had burned itself onto the inside of his skull. The silence from the church was absolute, a void that was somehow more menacing than the chaos that had preceded it. He did not wait for the silence to break. He ran. He fled the holy ground, his feet slipping on the damp grass, and plunged into the labyrinth of the town's sleeping streets. The town at night was a different entity from the one he knew by day. The familiar storefronts of the baker, the tailor, and the smithy were transformed into dark, hollow-eyed facades, their windows like vacant, staring sockets. The narrow, cobblestoned lanes twisted and turned, each corner promising a deeper, more impenetrable darkness. The only light came from the slivers of a cold, indifferent moon that managed to pierce the thick blanket of clouds, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to writhe and grasp at his heels as he passed. His own shadow was a frantic, elongated specter, a dark twin that he could not outrun. His breath came in ragged, painful sobs, each gasp a cloud of white vapor in the frigid air. His mind was a maelstrom of the images he had just witnessed, the impossible, glowing face of the dead boy, the silent, screaming whisper that had flooded his consciousness, the unholy tolling of the sanctified bells. He was not merely running from a place. He was running from his own memory, a futile and desperate flight from a horror that was now a permanent part of him. He had no destination. His flight was a frantic, aimless pinballing through the darkened town. He ran down the main street, past the mercantile and the town hall, its clock tower a dark finger pointing towards an empty heaven. He veered into a side alley, the enclosed space amplifying the sound of his own frantic footsteps, the walls seeming to close in on him. He could feel the cold, rough texture of the brick against his shoulder as he scraped past, his clothes catching on a loose nail. The alley smelled of stale beer and refuse, a rank, earthly smell that did nothing to dispel the unholy terror that clung to him. He emerged onto another street, this one residential, the small, dark houses huddled together as if for warmth. Behind their shuttered windows, the townspeople slept, blissfully unaware of the madness that had been unleashed in their midst. He felt a surge of envy so profound it was almost a physical pain. He would never sleep like that again. He would never know a moment's peace. He was now a man set apart, a solitary witness to a truth so terrible that it had shattered the world. He was alone, utterly and completely alone in his knowledge. It was as he passed the town square for the second time, his lungs burning as if filled with hot coals, that the sound came again. It was not the whisper, it was the bell, just once. A single, final toll that was not a chaotic crash like before, but a slow, deliberate, and resonant peal. Bong. The sound rolled through the empty streets with the force of a physical wave, clear and pure and utterly malevolent. It was not a sound of alarm this time, but a sound of pronouncement, of finality. It was a sound that seemed to say, "You cannot escape." It chased him down the length of the street, the deep, bronze vibrations seeming to follow him, to wrap around him, to seep into his very bones. He cried out, a thin, hopeless wail, and pushed himself to run faster, his legs screaming in protest, his vision beginning to blur at the edges from sheer exhaustion. The sound faded slowly, its echo lingering in the cold night air long after the initial peal had ended, a final, chilling punctuation mark on his ordeal in the church. And then came the silence, a silence deeper and more profound than any he had ever known. The world seemed to fall away into a vacuum of absolute stillness. There was no wind, no rustle of unseen animals in the dark, not even the hiss of the gas lamps, for they had all been extinguished hours ago. The only sound left in the universe was the frantic, panicked drumming of his own heart and the blood roaring in his ears. He finally stumbled to a halt in a small dead-end alley behind the tannery, his body unable to carry him a single step further. He collapsed against a cold, damp brick wall, sliding down its length until he was slumped on the ground amidst the filth and the shadows. His body shook with violent, uncontrollable tremors, a storm of adrenaline and terror that had finally overwhelmed him. He drew his knees up to his chest, wrapping his arms around them, trying to make himself as small as possible, as if he could somehow hide from the immensity of what he had experienced. He sat there, shivering in the dark, and he waited. He did not know what he was waiting for, but he felt with a grim certainty that the night was not yet finished with him. The silence stretched on for an eternity. He closed his eyes, but the image of the glowing face in the window was burned onto the inside of his eyelids, a permanent after-image that he knew he would carry with him to his grave. The memory of the silent whisper still echoed in the chambers of his mind, a psychic wound that would never heal. He thought of the body in the morgue, the small, still, innocent-looking form on the stone slab, a vessel, an anchor, a doorway through which something ancient and terrible had found its way into the world. He had no name for it, no framework to understand it. It was simply a wrongness, a fundamental perversion of the natural order, a blasphemy against the very concepts of life and death. It was then, as he sat shivering in the absolute, tomb-like stillness, that the final horror began. It started not as a sound, but as a feeling, a subtle shift in the air around him. A faint, cold breeze began to stir, rustling a pile of dead leaves in the corner of the alley, and on that breeze, It came. The whisper. It was not behind him anymore. It was not in his head. It was everywhere. It was in the dry, sibilant rustle of the leaves. It was in the faint, mournful sigh of the wind as it moved through the eaves of the buildings. It was in the barely audible scrape of a loose shutter somewhere down the street. The sounds were so faint, so natural, that anyone else would have dismissed them as nothing more than the ordinary sounds of the night. But Ephraim knew better. He could hear the intelligence behind them, the articulate, sorrowful, menacing cadence that he now recognized. The whisper was no longer a localized phenomenon. It had broken free. It had bled out into the world itself. It was now part of the very air he breathed. The night was its voice. He did not run this time. There was nowhere left to run. You could not flee from the air itself. You could not escape the sound of the wind. A strange, terrifying calm settled over him, the kind of calm that comes when all hope is extinguished. He slowly, deliberately got to his feet. He stood in the center of the alley, his head tilted slightly, and he listened. He listened as the whispers of the dead boy wove themselves into the fabric of the night, a permanent, sorrowful ghost in the machinery of the world. He understood then that the story was not over. It would never be over. The whispers would remain, a lingering, eternal question mark. What became of Ephraim is not a matter of official record. He was not seen in the town again. His small room above the bakery was found undisturbed, the stew his landlady had left for him, sitting cold and untouched on the table. Some said he simply fled, running until the world ran out. Others whispered that he had gone mad, and now wandered the lonely roads between towns, forever listening to the voice of the wind. The body of Tobias Drexler was quietly buried the next day in a small, private ceremony, his parents' faces masks of an unreadable, silent grief. The official cause of death remained a fever, but the whispers did not end with the burial. They became a part of the town's folklore, a story told in hushed tones by parents to frighten their children, a local legend that hinted at a terrible, unresolved truth. The story of a boy who was not breathing, but who had, somehow, kept whispering. The file on Tobias Drexler is now returned to the shadows. Your witness to its final entry is valued more than words can say. Subscribe to the Blasphemy Archive to join the circle when the next forgotten record is drawn into the light, and share in the comments what this account has awakened in you.